two very different people. Professor Dorothee Sille, now teaching theology at Union Theological Seminary in New York, and Dr. Beyers Naudé, Secretary of the Council of Churches of South Africa. Dr. Sille, how well do you know this Reverend Beyers Naudé, and what makes it so important for you to meet him?
I do believe it has to do with our Christian heritage and its future. And reading through some of what you did and lived through in the last years, I wondered about your inner growth and development. But these are just secular words. What I really mean is much more spiritual and is called conversion. It's turning around from one way to another one, and I think that is what interests me most about your life and the life of all my fellow Christians and my own life as well. How does God work with us in our times and convert us from our wrong ways?
I perhaps should say that I come from a very conservative, deeply religious Afrikaner home. My father was also a minister of religion, steeped in the Calvinist tradition, strong, very strong in his feelings of loyalty to his people, a patriot in the best sense of the word as seen by the Afrikaner people, fought in the Anglo-Boer War on the side of the Boers, had a deep friendship with one of the generals called Christian Friedrich Beyers. That is why my name is not a family name. I was named after General Beyers after he died shortly before I was born. So in that sense, my whole background is one of a deeply religious, strongly nationalist Afrikaner tradition. I understand that many people find it difficult to understand and to believe how it has been possible for somebody coming from that background, with my whole education, my position, which I held in the Dutch Reformed Church, the NG Kerk, where I was elected as the moderator of one of the regional synods, with the fact that for 23 years I was a member of the secret Afrikaans organization called the Afrikaner Broederbond. What happened to me? I think there are three major factors which contributed to my conversion. The first is a theological one. When after the Second World War, in looking at what was happening in Africa, the whole process of decolonization, freedom, political freedom coming to Africa, the cry, of millions of Africans throughout the continent to throw off the yoke of colonialism. With my deep interest in mission, in evangelism, and in the youth work of the church, I asked myself, what does this say to us in South Africa, knowing the stand which my church had taken with regard to apartheid? And that led me to a self-study of the traditional ways in which the Dutch Reformed Church, the NG Kerk, justified the whole policy of apartheid on biblical grounds. I did the study in between my ministry and eventually came to the conclusion that there was no way in which I could justify on biblical grounds the whole policy of apartheid, as was done by my church. That both the interpretation which they gave to certain passages in the Old and the New Testament, that these were either unconsciously or deliberately so distorted, so one-sided, so politically or ideologically motivated and loaded. I think for the first time in my life, there was this theological crisis. But I was afraid to make this known because I knew with my position of leadership in the church, with my position in the Broederbond, I knew that if I started to express these new convictions in public, that it would lead to a tremendous storm, reaction, protest, anger, rejection. And then I think a second event in my life, or series of events, which subsequently I saw, to be, if I may describe it in this way, the hand of God guiding me into a new direction, was the fact that I was elected as the acting moderator of the Transvaal Synod. And in that position, young ministers, white ministers, who were serving African and colored and Indian congregations, came to me with the problems which they were experiencing within their own congregations, the painful experiences of their own people with what apartheid laws were doing to them. And when they came to me and described to me what they themselves had experienced, I could not believe this. I told them, I said, I know you because they were students when I was a university pastor in Pretoria. I came to know them very well. There was a very fine, open, warm relationship. And I said to them, it's impossible. It can't be. And then they invited me to come to their congregations, which I did. I met with their church councils. I met with members of the congregation. I met with families who were deeply divided because of for instance, the Mixed Marriages Act, the Group Areas Act. And I was shattered. To me, it was an experience, which led me with the situation of being totally lost. And then came Sharpeville. That was the third event. In March, 21st of March 1960, where the peaceful protest march of people was disrupted by 69 people being shot, most of them in their back when they fled. And that, in a certain sense, culminated the whole situation.
Yeah, they repeated that this spring.
And there was no way, in which I could still get out of it any longer. It was, in fact, subsequently the way in which I felt that God, in a certain sense, had guided me all along and said to me, okay, I'll give you the time to think about it, to reflect upon it. But all of a sudden there was that crisis, and there was no option, except to stand by what I then had discovered to be the truth.
You were speaking about crisis and fear and change. So can we ask you, Dr. Sölle, what happened to that upper middle class liberal German girl that she is now has become Dorothee Sölle? You must now fear, and you must now have known very deep changes in your life.
I think one root of my changing and continuation of change has to do with my national identity, being a German and not denying that at no point, inheriting this terrible heritage which I cannot wash off from me. It's just a part of my life to be a German, to think in that language, to talk and to know what my country, or what was done to the Jewish people in the name of my country, im Namen des deutschen Volkes. Every single Jew who was gassed in the name of my country. And I think the consequence of the lifelong learning process coming out of this is a quest for truth. Why did that happen? What did those nice people who played the violoncello and read Goethe and did all these things, or at least tolerated them, what happened to them? What are the deepest reasons? It's not just one demon called Adolf Hitler. That's ridiculous. But I ask not only my country, but also my class, the bourgeois class, how come that this class so often pretended not to know or having nothing to do with it? And how is this related to our present stage? And I would like to make a remark about apartheid, what that means to me. It's I think 3 or 4 years ago, I met 2 young white students from your country in the United States, and we got to talk a little bit. And I asked them about the situation in South Africa, and asked them about the situation of black people, and specifically about whether they knew Soweto had been there, whether they knew whether the people had water or not in their huts or barracks, whether they had light or not. Very specific questions, and they didn't know a thing. They knew the golf and tennis places where they used to play. They knew their little schools. They knew how beautiful their country was. They gave me a story as if they were talking for a travel agent, how beautiful that country is. And they did not respond to any of my more and more specific questions because they didn't know. They simply did not know the reality of their own country. And there is an invisible wall, which is much worse than the Berlin Wall in my country. I think a wall which is terrible. And I think most of my country fellow people live behind that wall, because apartheid is not just a South African problem. It's a problem of the rich world and the so-called first world. That we live in apartheid and we live behind that wall, and we know about the nice cheap bananas and nice coffee we get from these poor countries, and we know a lot of things we can have and buy and go to, but our perspective is still the perspective of such a tourist and not a perspective of a sister or a brother.
May I
Yeah, of course.
respond and make some remark to that? You remind me of perhaps one of the most painful aspects of our life in South Africa. Because I constantly ask myself, how is it possible that here a community, in this case a white community, deeply religious, claiming to be devoutly Christian, building their whole life, or claiming to build their life, and also their political structure on the recognition of God's sovereignty as it stands in our Constitution. How is it possible that we could, for instance, remove forcibly 3.5 million people from their land, from where they live, from where they settle, from where they're happy as a community, force them into arid, remote areas where the possibility of livelihood, of income, of existence is in fact so small that for all practical purposes it is a process of slow death which they are facing.
It is.
And you know, the agony of this, especially because I know that the people who are in control and in power doing this, these are my people. I cannot deny that I am an Afrikaner. I don't want to deny it. How can I? I'm nothing else but an Afrikaner. And yet, in that sense, I don't see myself to be there. And then the agony of that. What are the basic roots? What are the deepest roots of such an injustice, of such an inhumanity? How do we continue to justify it? And that in the face of the fact that the whole world outside is telling white South Africa, this is wrong, this is inhuman, and this is evil. I think the first reason is that in the Afrikaner society, there is such a deep sense of loyalty to a wrong concept. Loyalty to your people, loyalty to your country, loyalty and patriotism have in a certain sense become deeply religious values. They've been converted into deeply religious values. So that anybody who is seen to be disloyal, therefore, to his nation, to his people, is not only deemed to be a traitor, but in the deeper sense of the word, he is betraying God. Mm-hmm. He is betraying the deepest values, of the understanding of faith as it was portrayed. So again, the basic problem is not an economic one or a cultural one or a social one, although all these factors play a role, of the deep sense of unity of the Afrikaner people, the fact that you are allowed, to have your differences within your Afrikaner people, but only to a degree. You must know where the boundary is of dissent and of disagreement. But the moment you overstep that boundary, and that line is very finely drawn and invisible, but the moment you overstep it, you are totally out. You are ostracized, you are pushed aside, you are seen to be a traitor, and humanly speaking, you are never taken back. And I think in my case, it was the fact that the Afrikaner people see themselves to be a minority, feel themselves to be threatened. Their own history has been built up on the basis of fear.
Yeah.
The threat, from the black majority, the threat from British imperialism, the threat coming from others, and therefore the lager mentality in which our people always felt that true patriotism and true loyalty was you stand by your people regardless of.
I couldn't agree more in regards to my own country.
Both of you seem to be very disappointed in the church, in your own church, in the church as such. Is there any future for this church, do you think?
In all of that, I'm not so skeptical about God's work elsewhere, but I think it starts again, as it did in the New Testament, with the poor and not with the rich.
If I could respond by saying, I think it depends what we mean by church. If we mean by church, mainly the institution, the structure, the visible, traditional symbols, then I believe that the church, in that sense, will experience the one crisis after the other until it comes to the recognition, the understanding that the church in the real sense of the word is where the people of God are, where life is being discovered again, their true meaning of love, of human community, of mutual concern for one another, of caring of people, of seeking, true, meaningful relationship, understanding between people, not only between Christians, but between people. And therefore, in that sense, I am very hopeful about what is happening. Not only in our country, but also in other countries, because there are new perspectives, of the Christian faith and of truth, which are being discovered and which are being, as it were, agonized about by many small groups of people with tremendously encouraging insights and examples which are coming through. And if I think of South Africa, what encourages me is the fact that sometimes the most meaningful revelation about a new understanding of the Christian faith and about the Christian church and about Christian community comes from the poorest, comes from those communities which are normally not seen to be the ones with authority or with power, comes from those who normally never believe themselves to have any real message. But when once you begin to listen to what they're saying, it is absolutely marvelous. And then to discover, how little I know and how much I need to be constantly converted in my whole understanding and my whole willingness, therefore, in true humility, to sit at the feet of such people and learn and hear. And in that sense, I believe there is a tremendous future, for the Christian community in the world. But I would like to ask this question, Dorothy. do you see the possibility that out of all this tension and the agony and the conflict and the animosity and the fear of so many communities around the world, do you see the possibility that out of this, let me call it a confessing community, a confessing movement, could emerge and could be born, where people, well, first of all, those who proclaim Christ and confess Christ, that they, on the basis of their experience and their understanding, that they either intuitively, or perhaps consciously, begin to live and discover a deeper sense, of living, of loving, of sharing, of understanding, of forgiving, of being willing also to stand up for their convictions, and if necessary, suffering and dying. And that out of that, perhaps throughout the whole world, such a confessing movement could come forward. I'm thinking, for instance, of what happened with regard to the peace efforts here in Western Germany and other countries. Where did this come from? I mean, all of a sudden, there were thousands. In fact, there were millions of people.
Yeah.
Something had happened to them inside.
Yeah.
And they were drawn together by that deep conviction. Now, my question is it impossible to hope and to expect that something similar could happen with regard not only the whole issue of peace, but also of justice, of the removal of fear, of people to say, well, our value system, both economic and social and cultural, these have been so distorted in many respects that we feel this is not the way in which God intended life on earth to be. And therefore, the message which I felt very strongly or here at the Kirchentag, in the key theme, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. And there was a totally new vision, which I believe some of the young people not only received, but which they brought home to us in their understanding of what this means. And naturally their interpretation is vastly different from the theological interpretation which you will get, if you walk into the study of us as theologians and you pull out the one theological dissertation after the other.
Yeah, sure.
Vastly different. But isn't it more meaningful? Isn't it more existential? Isn't it closer to the reality?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Any true theological sentence includes a condemnation or a negative side. So the earth is the Lord's means the earth is not General Motors, not the United Fruit Companies, or whomever you could mention of those who own the earth. But you have to name the owners of the earth. It's not the Pentagons. And even if they take most of our woods and places to relax and make them into their country, taking our soil from us. But I think when you ask me, wouldn't it be possible, I really would say, you see, as I do, the signs of the time, and it happens already before our eyes, that the blind start to see. I mean, in my country, the peace movement grows slowly, but step by step, deep into the conservative sector of society. The blinds start to see. It grows that people understand what the real issue is and how peace and justice is interrelated, and that you cannot build peace upon militarism, but have to build it upon justice. There's no other way to build up peace. And this happens, I think, in many, many places all over the world. Helder Camara has called them Abrahamitic minorities. And this is the gestalt of it right now, but I think it grows and becomes more visible. And also the coalitions with other people coming from different traditions, maybe not the Christian faith, but other humanistic all religious traditions, going together with that.
Yeah.
And also, I have a strong sense that the respect for us Christians working in the movement has grown so much in the last years.
I think this was the first time you had the opportunity to ask each other very difficult questions. Let us now suppose that this is also the last time you see each other. Could be true, I don't hope so, but it could be true. What would be the most urgent question you would like to put?
You mean the question that we would like to put
To each other,
To each
yeah.
other. You start, Dorothy.
Why don't you start?
Okay. The question that I would like to put to you would be this. Do you, in yourself, have the strength to endure whatever may come to you by way of disappointment, by way of rejection, by way of non-recognition, by way of waiting, perhaps your whole life, without being able to participate in the victory of the truth that you're standing for? Do you believe that you will be able to sustain yourself through these years up to the very end?
I'm just thinking of a friend's answer to that when I was in a state of despair and had this sense of meaninglessness and never reaching anything. And then he told me that he talked about the cathedrals which were built during the Middle Ages. Most of them were built in 200 years, some in 300 years even. And some of the workers in those cathedrals never saw the whole building. They never went to pray there. They never saw the glass and all the beautiful things of where they gave their life for. And then this friend says to me, listen, Dorothy, we who are building the Cathedral of Peace, maybe we won't see it neither. We will die before it is completed. And yet we're going to build it. We're going on, even if we won't live in that building.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's true, and it, in a way, it fits with what I wanted to ask you. It's not a real television response when you ask that.
This is
But it just
a very uncommon interview.
I just thought of asking you, give me your blessing, my brother. I need it.
Yeah. Loving Father, in this moment of deep and meaningful togetherness, I thank you that I know your blessing is upon both of us and upon all of us who wish to seek truth and love and peace for the whole world. Give this to us. Help us to receive it and never to lose it.